first start with the distinct keyword, right? So distinct keyword is used to find out distinct values from the table. Distinct values or rows, or we can say records from a table, right? So what happens when we do a select star? We take all the records from the table, right? So when we use a distinct keyword, we can specify the columns, right, based on which we want to see the distinct values. If you want to see the distinct values from the entire table, you can give all the columns from this table employee and take the distinct values. See, when I say select distinct star from the table, it will give you all the distinct values from this table. And when you give star means distinct values on all these columns, right? So this is employee table. We have 10 records. We don't have any row level duplicates, right? So we will get all the records, but let's select this department ID and see what happens, right? Select distinct department ID from employee. You see the results. We are getting only 3 department IDs, 201, 202, and 203. These are the only distinct departments that we have in our employee table, right? So you can either find out the distinct values at a table level, which will include all the columns of the table, and that you can do using distinct star. And if you want to specify some particular column for which you want to get the distinct values, you can specify the column name. So you can also say distinct department ID, and I think we have the city column also in the employee table, right? You can see this. So this will give you the unique combination of department ID and city. So you see, like, we have results here like department ID 201, city is Bangalore, 201, we have Hyderabad, right? So 202. So it will give you all the distinct combinations of these two columns which you have in your table. So one question will come in interview. What are the ways to find unique records from a table, right? So this is a question. So the interviewer will ask you, like, I have a table employee, for example. I want to see all the unique records from this table. First option is you can just do a select distinct star from employees, which we just did, right? Which will give you distinct from all the columns. There are a few other ways to do it. We will discuss it as we move ahead. So just for now, keep it in mind. One way to find out the unique values from the table is using distinct keyword, right?
Okay.
So then comes the where clause, right? We already discussed on this. Just let's take one more example. Select star from employee, where, for example, city, like percentage L percentage. So all the cities which contains the character L. It's more like a revision of what we did last time. So if you see, Bangalore has the character L among all the cities. So all the employee details who stay in the city Bangalore will come up, right? Clear on the where clause?
Yes.
Yeah. So then comes the SQL wildcard. So how many wildcards do we have in SQL? We discussed it in the last class, right?
Star.
Star.
Dollar.
No, we don't consider star as wildcard. The wildcard entries are this: percentage,
underscore,
and underscore.
Yes.
And there are a few others like not symbol, which
not equal to.
Parikshit mentioned last time, right? We have this not equal to symbol. And there are
Square
square
bracket.
brackets which you can use to find a regex expression from this. So these are the SQL wildcards. And how do you use these wildcards? You always use them with the like keyword, right?
Okay.
Okay. So now let's come to this group by part, right? So this, what do you mean by group by, right? So as the name suggests, it says like we will be grouping a set of records based on a particular column or a combination of columns. For example, you are in a school, right? Now the total number of students in the school, like you are in a school, total students in schools is for example, let's say 400, right? So now the school has 10 classes, right? So when you will do a query like select star from school, for example, you will get the data for all the students in the school, which will give you 400 records, correct?
Yes.
So now that we took, the school has 10 classes, let's say each class will have how many students? If we divide by 10, 40 students, let's say, right? Now you want to find out now how many students are there in a class, and you want to group the students based on a class, right? So when you do a select star, it will give you all the records. And one thing you need to know about group by is like with group by, we should always use an aggregate function, right? Few of the examples of aggregate functions are like very common one that we use is count. Then we have max,
Average.
then we have min, then we have average, right? These are the most common used aggregate functions along with group by, right? So let's see. Let's take the employee example again, right? So if we do a select star from employee, we will get 10 records, right? So let me do a select count star from employees. So count star is a count function. It will give us the count of number of records, which is an employee table. So this gives us 10 records. Okay. Now, let's say I want to check the count of employees based on the department, like how many employees are there in each department. So to do that, we will have to use the group by clause. And what will we be grouping by on? We will be grouping by on department ID, right? So what do we want to get? We want to get the count of employees. So we'll do count star, and we will rename it as m count, for example. We are giving a column ls. And then on what basis we want to do the count? We want to get the count of the number of employees in each of the department. So the group by column will be department ID, right? Table name will be employee, right? And then group by keyword. On what basis we are grouping by? We are grouping by on department ID. Clear on this statement?
No, actually, it has mentioned that select count as a employee count. Then it will give a count. Okay. However, in the department ID, it will like these both are different syntax. Correct. Like suppose here we have used the alias that whatever the count will give the table name as a employee count.
Right.
And then department ID.
So I'm not clear on your question. Can you repeat it one more time?
Yes, Sushandu.
Can you?
Actually, yeah, it's like suppose first we have used the alias,
Mhm.
okay, like employee count. So it will create a table and give a name, employee count,
No,
whatever
no,
the
no.
count of
This is a
the.
column alias, right? It's not a table alias. So what will happen? Okay, let's see what is column alias. So let me do this. I will remove it and I will execute this query. Okay. So you see, I get the columns here. So the count I'm getting for each department. So in department 201, we have 4 employees. In department 202, we have 3 employees. In department 203, we have 3 employees. So total, how many records we had in the table? 10 records. If you
10
sum
record.
these 3 counts, it comes as 10, right?
Yes.
Right. So basically what we did, we grouped by department ID column and we just took a count, right? So
For each department ID.
for each department ID, yes. So when I give as employee count alias for this count, so you see in this particular column, you can see department ID as the column name, right? But for the count, you don't see any column name,
Okay.
right? So I'm just giving a column name so that any person who will read this
Okay.
data can know, okay, what is this 433? This is the employee count. So when I run this again, you see the column name came as employee count. So now if you read the
Have you just given the name to the column?
name to, yeah, we just gave the name to
Column.
this count column. Yes. Okay, so column alias is whatever name you will give, it will just take and display that name as the count, right? Clear on?
Shishandu,
Mhm.
if we mention instead of star, if we mention the department ID in the count, then what will happen? Like, will this
Sa-
count the?
Same thing. It will have. So if you say count of department ID, right, and you are doing a group by on department ID, let's see. Do you see any difference? It will not give you any difference because it is just taking the count of this,
Department ID.
how many records, how many department IDs are coming. But if you don't give a star, right, and if you
Okay.
give a distinct here, so count of distinct department ID as employee count, and then group by department ID,
Correct.
what will be the answer now?
1. It will give 1.
See, because you are taking distinct count. So even
Unique.
though there are 3 or 4 employees in department 201, but department ID for all those employees are what? 201. So when you take a
Correct.
unique count, it gives you 1. But if you remove distinct, since there were 4 entries and 4 times 201 will come as department ID, so
Correct.
you will get 4. So you need to remember, like, what we are doing here, we are taking the count of number of employees in each department. So either you can go with select star, or what we are counting employees, right? So you can go with employee ID,
Okay.
right? So count of employee ID will give you number of employees for each department. Okay.
Yeah.
So now let's see one more query. We will again take count of employees. I will not give alias this time because it was just example based on department ID and city, right? So I want to check the count of employees in each city and the department in that city. So from employee, group by, let's say, department ID and city, right? Let's see. Incorrect syntax. Select, oh, sorry. Select on star. So you see, like, there are 3 employees in department 201, which is in Bangalore. There are 1 employee in department 202, which is in Bangalore. 1 employee in department 203, which is in Bangalore again. 111 employees, all the states. So if you sum all of them, it will give you 10 records, right? 3 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, so 10 records, right? So now
Yes.
I want to select the employee IDs also. So I know there are 3 employees. I want to get the employee ID of this employee, or let's say name of the employees. Will this query work now?
No, as you have mentioned, it's supposed to be aggregated.
Supposed to be?
Aggregated function.
Okay. So let's run this query and see if it runs or not. You see, it will not run. So what is the error? Column employee.name
Column employee.
name is invalid in the select list because it is not part of an aggregate function or group by clause. So what does this error means? It means if you are selecting something, some columns from this table and taking an aggregate value of these columns, you should make sure whatever column is there in the select clause, all this column should be there in the group by. Right? If you're selecting name, department ID, and city, you need to make sure the name, department ID, and city is also there in the group by clause.
Group by.
So you see, first 2 queries work because here we did a group by on department ID, and in our select query, apart from count, we only had department ID, right? So always remember columns that are used in select should be part of group by while using an aggregate function. Okay, this so this is something you need to keep in mind. This is very important, and this kind of things people will ask in interview. So they will give you a group by statement, and they will ask you to find out what is wrong with the statement. They will ask you, will this statement run or not? So you need to make sure you keep an eye on the select statement. If you see 3 columns in select, you need to make sure there are 3 columns in group by also, right?
And that should be only when we are using like aggregate function.
Only when we are using aggregate function. Yes. So this thing, right? So we discussed one question: in how many ways can we find unique records from the table? Right? Let's take department ID from employee table. So I am using distinct. So it gives me 201, 202, 203, right? So other way will be select department ID from employee, group by department ID. So will this query work?
Select department ID. It won't, because it will just select, it will select the department ID column, and if we do the group by, yes, this will work.
Right. So what will be the output of this column, this statement?
Whatever the department ID, it will like if 2001, 2000, sorry, 201, 201, and 201, and then it will come 202 or something like that.
Let's see. So it is giving me 201, 202, 203, same as distinct keyword, right?
Okay.
So this is another way. If you want to find, because what are we doing here? We are grouping the data, right? So what we have in our table, 201, 201, 201, 201, 202, 202, 202, for example, right? We have these values. What are we doing here? So let's say we have employee ID 1 here, employee ID 2, employee ID 3, employee ID 4, right? Employee ID 5, employee ID 6, employee ID 7. So when we do a group by on department ID, right? If we select department ID, comma, count of employee ID from employee. What it does, it groups by on department ID, right? And then I'm doing a group by on department ID. What it does, it will see what all departments we have. So it will say 201, and we are grouping on 201. So we'll see how many values are there for 201. So there are 4 records for 201. So how many employee IDs? 4 employee IDs. So this will give you 2014. Then next will be 202, 2, because we have 2 employee IDs for 202, right? When you don't specify anything like count or no aggregate function, so what it does, it will just group by on department ID. How many departments are there? 201. So when it groups by on 201, it will just display 1201 because you are not doing any count, aggregate or something. So it just displays the unique group ID, which is 201. Similarly, it displays unique group ID, which is 202, department ID, I mean, right? So when you don't do any aggregate function, or when you don't give any aggregate functions in the select clause, and you just use the column in select and group by on that column, it will give you the unique value of that column. If this column has 100 records and all of them are different, it will give you 100 records. And if you have 100 records and 50 of them are duplicate, it will just give you 50 records. Like in this case, even though we have 6 records, right, it just gave us 201 and 202 because these are the unique values in department ID column. Are you guys clear on this part? This is very important concept. Like this is how group by works. So you should know how group by works. So you see how this will change, right? If I run this query, you get 201, 202, 203. The moment I give count star, right? What you will see only 3 records now also, right? 201, 203, because there are only 3 department IDs. Right? When I remove this count star, what happens? Only this column is getting removed. 433 will get removed. Right? So what should be the output? 201, 202, 203. Right? So with group by, we can do count. We can do max employee ID also. We can find the maximum employee ID for each department. Let's do this and check. Right? You see, we still get only 3 records because there are only 3 departments which we are grouping by on. If it's still giving us unique records along with this unique department IDs, it is giving us some aggregate values which we are trying to do. Right? So we get like the highest employee ID for department 201 is 107. The highest department ID for department 202 is 106. The highest department ID for department 203 is 110. Right? So you can also do the min department ID. Oh, sorry, min employee ID from this table. So you can add as many aggregate functions in one group by condition as you want. Only thing you need to make sure is whatever column is there in the select part, which is not in aggregate function, should be part of group by. Right? So clear on this part? So when the question will come, in how many ways can you find unique records from a table? First is using a distinct keyword. So you can do a distinct star from employee table, right? Which will give you all the unique records, or else you can do a group by on all the columns from employee table. Let me write that statement and show it to you. So we have how many columns here? We have employee ID, we have department ID, we have name, we have gender, we have phone number, we have city, we have salary, we have designation, right? So we selected all the columns that we have in this table. Now we need to make sure we get only the unique values. So what we need to do, we need to add all these columns which we have in select in the employee table, right? So the results of these 2 query will exactly be the same. You will get unique values. Clear on this part? So this is one of the most common interview questions. In how many ways can you find unique values from a table? So you can either use a distinct keyword, and if you don't want to give star, you can give it as distinct all the column names. It will make you easy to understand, right? So you're taking distinct values of these columns from employee table, or you're selecting all these columns and you're doing a group by on all the columns. So it will give you unique values of all the columns, right? And similarly, you can check with this statement which we did earlier, distinct department.
However, we need to make sure like whatever we are mentioning during the selection, it's supposed to be into group by also.
That is very important, yes. See, because if I miss any one record, right? Let's say I remove designation, you will get that error. Employee designation is invalid because it is not part of the group by clause. Right. So you need to make sure whatever is there in select should be part of group by. So this is similar to this, or select. Right. So first one is like to select all the unique records from a table. Second one is to select unique department ID from this table. So there are two ways. One is select distinct department ID. Second is group by on department ID. Right. So these two queries you can do. First one is for all the records. Second is for selected columns. So whatever columns you want to add after this, you can just add a comma. Just make sure you add that. You add that in group by also. Clear on this part?
Okay.
So with group by, there is one more concept of having clause, right? So which is only used along with group by. So you can use a having clause only when you are using a group by in your query. Without group by, you cannot use having clause. This is very important for you to remember, right? So there is a question which comes in interview. What is the difference between where clause and having clause? Difference between where and having clause. First thing question is this. Second question that comes is, can we use where and in the same query? These are two important interview questions which will come up. So as you know, where clause we used to filter out the records based on some condition, right? Like in department employee table example we saw, like where employee name equal to Paul, right? We're filtering some records. To filter, we use where condition, but having clause is same. We use having clause to filter aggregate values, the values that we get using this aggregate functions. To filter these values, we can directly use a having clause. Used to filter the results from aggregate functions, right? Let's see how it works.
That's when first step is aggregation, and then we can go with the having something like that.
Yes, so let's see how it works, right? So in this example, we took a count star of department ID from employee table, right? We are doing a group by on department ID. So what is the aggregate output of this particular query? The aggregate output is 433, right? Count of employee IDs, right? So now the question can come like this, right? I want to find the departments which have more than 3 employees. Okay, the question is, I want to find a department which has more than 3 employees. So how will you approach this? First, you need to group by department. You have to count all the employees in the department, and then you have to check which department has more than 3 employees, right? That's the step you will follow. So count, right? So what we did here, we wrote a query to count the number of employees in department ID, right? So now what we have to do, we have to filter out the department which has more than 3 employees. So what we can do, we can use a having clause here. Having, what we are checking, count greater than 3. So this count star is nothing but the count of employee ID, right? So I can run this query. You see, I'm getting only one department, 201, which has more than 3 employees. Clear why we use having clause?
Yes, that's clear. However, like suppose if we mention a count star, so it will, what does it will like? It will just take a count of. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, it will just take a count of number of records from the table. So you can do count star, you can do count one, so it's all same. Unless and until there is no null values in this column, it will be same. You're just taking count of something. So you can just specify one, you can specify star, or you can specify employee ID also. Right. So because we are taking the employee count, so you can use employee ID. So now this query works, right? So how do we do it without having clause? Let's say, sorry, let me keep this query as it is. We will see if there is any other way to do this part, right? What we are doing here.
We can like use where clause.
Department having more than employees. Clause. Let me give an alias to this column as employee count, right? So group by department ID. So how can we do it with where clause? Can we do it using a where clause?
Yes.
Let's see. Where
Count, like we can say we can where count employee ID greater than
where count employee ID greater than 3.
3.
Okay, let's see if this works or not. It says incorrect syntax near the keyword where. It's not working. So you cannot use a where condition after group by. You have to use where before group by. Okay? So since you cannot use where condition after group by, you cannot do this count. Right? Now you see why we use having here, because having you can use after group by, right? So if you want to use where, you have to use before group by. That is why to count any aggregate functions, or to filter out any aggregate function values, we use the having clause. You are clear on the part now why we cannot use a where condition here?
In where we cannot use aggregated function.
No, you cannot use a where condition after you add a group by condition. Where condition should be always before group by. Okay.
We can use the aggregate function to where.
Aggregate functions you can use.
And it's supposed to be before group by, not after group by.
Yeah, so that is the catch, right? So if you want to filter something, first you have to calculate the aggregate and then use a where condition on that using a subquery, right? So we'll see how to do that. So if you don't want to use a having clause, first this is your inner query. You took the count of employees as employee count. You gave a column alias. Now you will write an outer query, right? Select star from. What will the inner query? Inner query will be this statement. So now this output of this statement will be the table from which you're selecting. Let's give it a table name like T1. Okay. So now this is your table, like employee, right? Like this is a table. Now this data set will be your table. Got it? What is the output of this part? If I run only this part, it gives you 4, 201, 3, 202, 3, 202, right? And the column names here are employee count and department ID. So now imagine this as a table, not as a result, right? Got it? Clear on this part, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it means whatever the result of this subquery we have selected from T or something like that.
Yeah, so this subquery, result of this subquery, which is this employee count and department ID, which we are seeing here, will be the input for this query's outer query. So basically, this is now a table, temp table kind of thing, which is there in the memory now. Okay. So now we imagine this as a table. And now from this table, what do we want? We want to filter the employee department with employee count more than 3. Right. So if this is a table, how will we write the query? We'll write select from star from this table where employee count is more than 3. Make sense?
Okay, got it.
So now if you run this query,
Alternative, sorry.
what you get the output? 201. You see, so if you want to use a where condition and get the same output which we got using having, you have to use a subquery. And first you have to group the data based on department ID, take the count, store it in an intermediate table, which is the inner query here, and then do a select star from that table and filter using a where condition those employees whose count is more than 3, right? Where employee count is more than 3. So with where we have to write 2 queries here, basically using a subquery. And this is the reason having clause comes handy with group by, because you can just do the same operation that we did here in 2 queries, right, in a single query. Now the best part here is if you want to just see the department ID having more than 3 employees, you don't even have to take the count in the select statement. You can directly select department ID from employee, group by department ID, having employee count of employee ID greater than 3. If you just run this also, it will give you the department ID 201. You don't have to specifically select this count star or count employee ID in the select statement. If you just want a department ID, you can just give 201. And if you want to display the number of employees also in this department, then we can go with the count also. Means it will come in the output also how many employee IDs are there. Right? Clear on this having part and how having and where are different?
Yes.
Okay. So now you have to remember this execution. Sorry, not execution flow. How do I explain that? Order of keywords in any SQL query, right? So QUERY. So order of keywords in any SQL query. You should remember the first keyword is select, right?
Okay.
Yes.
So you give some stars or some column name. After that, next keyword is what? From.
Correct.
Right? Then comes the table name. It can be anything, right? Next keyword will come is where, right? Which you filter on some condition. Right? After where condition, if you want to group the data based on some particular columns, then comes group by. Right? Group columns. And if you are using group by and you want to filter on some aggregate values, you can use having clause. Yeah. It will be aggregate filter. After all this, if you want to order your data in ascending or descending order based on any of the columns, you can use order by. Column names and the order of sort which you want in ascending or descending order. By default, it is ascending order. You can change it to descending order as per your requirements, right? So this is the order in which the keywords will be written in any SQL query. So you see, we are selecting from table, then we are filtering if we want to filter some data. After filtering, we will do a group by on the result set. Then if you want to add having clause, you can add. This is optional, right? You don't have to add it every time you use a group by. Having clause is optional, depends on the scenario in which you are using the group by. And if you want to sort the data, you have to make sure order by is at the end. After order by, you can make it ascending or descending order based on your specific requirement, right? So now few other keywords comes in between where condition. This will be joins, right? So there can be multiple join. We have inner join, we have left join, right join, full outer join. So this will come in between. So this is the overall execution flow. Clear on this execution flow, how we write SQL queries?
Yes. So like this is the steps which you need to follow every time.
Every
And
time you
this
write
is
a query, yeah. So
and this is
few things are optional, like joins are optional, right? You don't write joins every time, right? So this is optional, and it should come always between from and where condition, right? So group by is also optional. Having is optional because it will come when you
case
use a
also.
group by. Huh? Order by is
Case.
what case statement?
Yeah, one case statements also comes into the optional, correct? Like it.
Case will come optional. Case is in select part. Select star.
Okay.
You can use select column, you can use case statements, everything. That all comes in select. So, right, but this is the execution flow. In all your queries, mostly you will have select, from, where condition, order by, right? All the joins and group by and having clause are optional, but this is the execution flow. So you cannot write a where condition after group by statement, right? You cannot write a having before group by, you cannot order before group by. So this is the order you have to follow, and this is very important. Just remember this flow. So this is how we write the query, but how it executes. Anyone knows how the query will execute? In what order?
Like it starts from the like whatever you have mentioned, like as per that, like the step which you have mentioned. Like if it's select whatever the columns and then it goes to for DB and
Execution
then
is first it will start from, because how database will read, it will first go to the table, right? You are selecting few columns from what? From table. First it will go to the table, right? So first part it looks is from part. When you execute a query, what happens at the backend, right? SQL Server first goes at the from part, checks the table name, from which table it has to fetch the data, right? So then it checks, is there any filter in the table? Because it's always good to filter out number of records before processing, because the less number of records, the higher the processing speed we will get, right? If you are selecting all the data from a table, our processing will be slow, right? So then it will check if there is any filter condition present or not, if we have any where condition or not. So it goes to the table, applies the where condition, gets the data set that it wants, right? Then it checks, do I have a group by on which I can group the data? So if we have a group by, it will perform the group by part. So after group by, it will check, do I have a having clause to filter out more data? So if yes, then it will execute the having clause. After all this, finally it will select your data that it needs to display. Whatever columns you have in your select statement will come next, right? After selecting, what we need to do, we need to order the data. So if you are sorting the data, then it needs to show the data in the sorted order to you, right? Finally it will do order by on your condition. So when you write a query, you write in this order, select, from, join, where. When you execute a query, it always goes in this order, from, where, group by, having, finally selects, and selecting in which order is defined by order by clause. By default, it is ascending. clear on how we write a query and how it executes at the backend.
Yes.
So this one, no one will teach you, but this is something you need to remember, because if you know this flow, it will help you tune your queries, right? Because you now know, okay, if there are multiple joins and the table has millions of records, so you know where condition will execute next. So you can filter out the records using where condition based on your requirement. It will improve the performance of the query. So if you know this flow, it will be very helpful for you in later point of time to tune the queries. So
So
remember,
in the end, like this, after the having the select, that's mean it will select that records.
select means whatever columns you want to say. Select, right? Like in
Column or record?
column department ID. So if you say select department ID, it will give you the values in department ID. For example, 201, 202, 203, right?
Okay.
Like that. So this is the order of execution. So now we also saw how having is different from where condition. Why do we use having condition clause with group by? Clear on this group by and having? How do we do it?
Yes.
So I
Yes.
just used count. So it's your responsibility to try with different aggregate functions. Max, minimum. Try this employee ID. Try make it star, make it one, make it null. See what happens. Then if you see any questions or if you get in doubt, ping me in WhatsApp anytime.